call up my amendment 2043 and ask consent that it be modified with the changes at the desk.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will report.
The Senator from New Mexico, Mr. Udall, proposes amendment number 2043 as modified.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote on amendment number 2043 offered by the Senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, this amendment strikes the provisions allowing UPS to move to 5-day service in 2 years. 2 years is simply not enough time to see the changes we're making in this bill take effect before we cut this essential service. My amendment does not say we never move to 5-day service, but what it does say is that 2 years is not enough time for the Postal Service to implement the many cost-saving measures in the bill. Why eliminate one of the key competitive advantages and hurt rural America before we know what the effects of these reforms are? It makes no sense. Why would we make a change that would reduce mail volume by almost 7%? Isn't that why we got in this crisis in the first place? I hope my colleagues will join me in protecting rural jobs and go on record to say clearly that moving to 5-day service should be a last resort. Reserve my time.
Madam President.
The Senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, I rise to oppose the amendment by my friend from New Mexico. I know there are a lot of people who don't want to lose 6-day delivery, but the greater imperative is not to lose the Postal Service as we know it. The Postmaster asked for the immediate authority to go from 6 days of delivery to 5. In this bill, we've given the Postmaster authority in many different areas to save money. We said as a result that we will not give him the authority to go from 6 days of delivery to 5 for 2 years, hoping that within the 2 years he can save enough money not to have to make this change. Frankly, I'm skeptical that he can, but we wanted to give him in 6 days delivery at least that last opportunity. To pull this out of the bill, this procedure with a lot of due process in it, before the move can be made from 6 to 5 days, really removes the credibility from the bill and I think will jeopardize its ultimate adoption. So with a lot of respect and affection for my friend from New Mexico, I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment.
Madam President.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President, this amendment would also take $8.9 billion that is supposed to go to pay for retiree health benefits of postal workers and instead redirects those funds to maintain 6-day-a-week delivery of the mail. Now, I hope that we always have 6-day-a-week delivery. I think that that is an asset. I think we should strive to preserve it, and that's why our bill prohibits going to 5-day delivery for 2 years.
The opposition's time has expired.
To wring all the waste out of the system.
Madam President, Saturday service is absolutely essential in these rural areas. I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayat, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio,
Sanders.
Gotcha. Gotcha, sir. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inoue, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Carey, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Begich, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Franken, Johnson of South Dakota, Klobuchar, Cole, Leahy, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, and Wyden. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Coburn. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Burr, Carper, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Corker, Crapo, Feinstein, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Hatch, Heller, Hoven, Hutchison, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Lieberman, Lugar, Moran, Portman, Risch, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Warner, and Wicker. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. DeMint. Mr. DeMint, no. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, no. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Akaka, no. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb, no. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, no. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, Aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus. Aye. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. No. Mr. Brasso. Mr. Brasso. No. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. No. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul. No. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow. Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill. Aye. Mr. Coates. No. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain. No. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte. No. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Aye. Landrieu. Mr. Schumer. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu. No. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer. Aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg. Aye. Mr. Levin. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye.
White House for White House. White House. Myra, you wrote that down about the office?
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their votes? On this vote, the yeas are 43, the nays are 56. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Yes. 43 to 56. Not agreed. Oh, we had agreed.
Madam President,
The senator from Connecticut.
I move to
The Senate will be in order.
Madam President, I move to reconsider and lay the motion on the table.
Without objection.
Madam President,
The senator from Illinois.
I call up my amendment number 2082 and ask consent that it be modified with the changes that are at the desk.
Is there objection? If there are no objections, so ordered, the clerk will report.
The senator from Illinois, Mr. Durbin, proposes amendment number 2082 as modified.
Madam President, I ask consent that